it's really the leaders that have the emotional intelligence skills that are the ones that stay. We used to rely on promoting leaders, again, for technical skills. You needed to have all the answers, so to speak, to guide your team forward. We don't need that anymore. When we have processing power and knowledge at our fingertips, we need leaders who actually know how to integrate change and motivate their team. And so I often refer to technical skills as the work of one, where emotional intelligence is about amplifying the work of many. That's the focus, whether that's going to be frontline manager, middle manager, or senior leaders. Those are the leaders that are really going to stay and bring that clarity that so many people right now are desperately looking for and looking to their leaders to guide them.
Hi there, and welcome to the Step Up Podcast. I'm your host, Kent Knievel. Every week, I talk to experts who focus on helping leaders step up their leadership game and leaders telling their stories of growing up through the ranks. If you're new to the show, do me a favor and subscribe so you never miss an episode. One last thing. As a leadership development consultant and executive coach, focus area of mine is supporting newly promoted leaders. 1 in 3 promotions fail because we never teach newly minted VPs how to stop being a director, or a newly promoted director how to stop being a manager. If that's you, or if you support a leader who has been recently promoted, I encourage you to visit my website at kent.coach/toolkit and download a free copy of the Promoted Leader Toolkit, filled with practical advice and tools to help new leaders stick the landing and truly step up to their new leadership level. All right, I've dillied and dallied long enough. On with the show. Welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the harder skills to truly learn and, deploy, which is emotional intelligence. I want to call it a hard skill because I just remember from my background having these conversations of why are the things we call quote unquote soft skills some of the actual hardest ones to learn and implement. And with me for this conversation today is Dana Echert. She's the founder of Inspire. Welcome, Dana. Thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah, well, before we really get into it, for the audience that doesn't know you yet, I would love for you to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background.
Often joke that I've been studying group dynamics since birth because I'm actually a triplet. Wow. I understood what it meant to be a team player and often leadership development very early on. But I actually started my professional career at being accepted into a leadership development program as a participant myself, so I started in hospitality operations, which feels very full circle to have started in a leadership development program and now having spent my career really building out leadership development programs. But as I said, my early career was in hospitality operations. And if you've ever worked in hospitality, you get the extremes of leadership very, very early on. I kid you not, my very first week as a manager at the age of 22, I had to hire and fire someone all in that week. Talk about being thrown in the deep end right away. But I dealt with conflicts, personal or professional issues, people testing me. I mean, a lot of people weren't necessarily pleased to have the 22-year-old manager. And so I had to deal with that pressure in real time. And one of the pieces that really is where I officially kind of moved over to learning and development, and that aha moment was my organization had high turnover, and I helped put together a train the trainer program. At the time, again, remember, I was 22. I thought I was quite brilliant and clever, having come up with the name Train the Trainer, only to then, once I moved into learning and development, find out that's the most common name for a program like that. But it really just shared the love of building systems that helped people learn, lead, and perform.
Nice. Yeah, I think, from my time at Buffalo Wild Wings, I still remember it was a regional manager, perhaps, or a divisional leader. Because I didn't know this at the time, and I'm not sure if the statistic holds, but it was something like a third of the country, of the U.S., their first job is in food service. Right?
I would be surprised by that, yeah.
And how they followed that up with was like, what an honor we have to train America's workforce, right? Because not everybody stays in food service, but oftentimes, it's people's first jobs. And I remember how hard, management is, kind of front, so to speak, frontline management at the store level, right? Because oftentimes you're tapped to be a leader within the same store that you sort of grew up in. And so, literally, and I'm kind of thinking about your experience here at 22 of maybe this wasn't exactly your experience, but you're a server or what have you, bartender on Monday, and on Tuesday you're suddenly all your peers' boss, and not everybody. That is a hard transition. That is a very hard transition.
Yeah, I was within the Accelerate to Leadership program. I was just immediately stepped into leadership, but this is also my first role out of college. So that was quite the experience. But really, talking about emotional intelligence, where my heart really lies now, during those early times, I actually had a foundational moment of seeing what it actually means to have emotional intelligence in leadership. And this was about probably a year or so into being a people leader. I was helping open up a new restaurant at the location I was at. And my director was visiting my location. And from your experience in hospitality, things can get heated on the line every once in a while. And so I don't remember what she got upset about. That part has totally escaped me. What I remember so vividly is what she did next. The following day, she came back to my operation, pulled me, a new manager and my team aside, and apologized for her behavior. Said that wasn't how she wanted to show up as a leader, and asked for all of forgiveness. Again, for an early leader myself, I was like, my God, this is what leadership is all about. She was human. She had a moment where she reacted, but it's what she did next and how she responded and changed the intent. And seeing that ripple effect through not just myself, but clearly it's been foundational for me, but also through the team and how we navigated further challenges and how we were, showcased accountability from that example of the director. And again, I think it's just even more telling the fact that this was her indirect reports that she also apologized, not just me, her direct report. And, when we talk about technical skills, she had to know the ability to walk and talk. That is it. But when we talk about emotional intelligence, she had to have self-awareness, humility, stress management, relational skills, and the decision to repair. And that takes a lot of work. And again, that is just so formative into what leadership really requires.
Yeah, that sounds very uncommon. I think the more typical approach, if a leader isn't, managing themselves well, is they just move along. They get to do that. They get to be that way if they want to. And so to have a leader pull you and the team aside to apologize, that's really interesting.
Yeah. It was again, this is why emotional intelligence is so important. Those are the type of leaders I hope to continue to build, through my business Inspire. But, after I left operations and after I built that the training program, as I mentioned, that's when I officially stepped into learning and development. And I actually moved over to a Forbes 5-star resort. And so talk about the environment, it's now fully in person, frontline heavy work. I'm deeply focused on service standards, as you can imagine, being Forbes 5 stars. So then I moved into a global remote tech company that was shifting from very much of a startup feel to a more organizational structure. And so that meant putting a lot of people systems in place, such as onboarding, performance reviews, talent calibrations, leadership development, all really for the first time in a culture that change was constant, anyone working in tech. So on the surface, these environments were completely different, from enterprise to resort to tech. But what I saw was the same pattern kept showing up. Now, each organization may have named it differently. One might have called it communication, whereas the other one called it accountability, or they focused on turnover or engagement or just simple change fatigue. But underneath that, there was often a need for stronger emotional intelligence, trust, and clarity inside the organization and among its leaders. And that is really what shaped the work that I do through Inspire.
Nice. So what is your, before I guess we get into the topic, what does your company do today? Who are you working with? Whose ears should perk up on who's listening today?
Yeah. So my work now focuses on working with organizations to build up the emotional intelligence, trust, and psychological safety within an organization, really what I define as the human drivers. And I help shape leaders with the relational skills and organizations with the structural clarity to integrate change and build a stronger workforce.
Nice. So aside from the sort of these formative experiences that you're talking about with EQ, right? Because I feel like it's interesting because I feel like over the last at least 10, maybe 15 years, I feel like I've seen emotional intelligence kind of ebb and flow in and out of sort of, I don't know,
popularity. Yeah.
Popularity. Yeah. Like it kind of,
Yeah.
it ebbs and flows in and out. So what kind of has brought this sort of to the forefront for you as like a central tenet of what you're doing?
So the interesting thing is the data around high emotional intelligence leaders and high performance has been around for decades. Anyone who can speak to having had a leader moment like the one I shared knows exactly the impact of it. But what's really interesting is the world that we're living in today. I know at this point we're almost so tired of hearing it, but we are living through a major evolution of work. AI, disruption, change, restructuring, all of this is happening. And we are living in a state of uncertainty. And that requires something different of leadership. The pace of change is exposing the gap. It's exposing the gap of, especially around relational skills. And because many leaders were promoted with technical expertise, but we're never really given the tools to lead through relational complexity like we're living through today. And I think that's why it's so formative right now. Because when change happens, as you know from your experience, performance often dips. And the reason may not be always so clear, but it's pretty simple. It's because trust and clarity dip at those moments. But the challenge now is that leaders barely have time to stabilize themselves or in their team before another massive change comes around the corner. And so in my work, it's really, although I work with all leaders, it's really the middle managers that are often really heavily carrying the load of this impact because they're the ones who necessarily didn't make the decision, but they have to translate it, become essentially the emotional shock absorbers of what's happening, and create enough clarity for their team to integrate it. And so that's really the work that I do is shifting leaders from reacting to responding.
Well, and middle management right now, from what I'm reading, seeing, hearing, middle managers right now are sort of in the biggest. I get this is kind of a yes and to what you were saying, right? They're in the middle. They're pinched in the middle between upper management and the employees. But also from what we're seeing and hearing, some organizations, there's a big target on their backs as a group to kind of flatten, right? That, at least from what I'm seeing, right? That when we think about AI adoption, right? Frontline workers are concerned about what's going to happen to their roles. But interestingly, so are middle managers, right? Anyway, I guess I'm kind of curious what your experience with kind of that pinch point in particular with managers is right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's probably pretty clear that organizations, at least my interpretation of what's happening and evolving as far as organizations, are slimming down. So yes, kind of roles of all levels are slimming down. Middle managers would be one in particular. But it's really the leaders that have the emotional intelligence skills that are the ones that stay. You know, we used to rely on promoting leaders again for technical skills. You needed to have all the answers, so to speak, to guide your team forward. We don't need that anymore. When we have processing power and knowledge at our fingertips, we need leaders who actually know how to integrate change and motivate their team. And so I often refer to technical skills as the work of one, where emotional intelligence is about amplifying the work of many. That's the focus, whether that's going to be frontline manager, middle manager, or senior leaders. Those are the leaders that are really going to stay and bring that clarity that so many people right now are desperately looking for and looking to their leaders to guide them.
The increasing importance of quote unquote soft skills, right? The increasing importance of emotional intelligence and maybe even self-regulation as AI is kind of coming in. And I mean, I should start date stamping these conversations because I feel like there's such a ebb and flow of what's happening with AI, right? I think, recent news is how much money companies have burned, laid off a bunch of people and then burned even more cash trying to, make AI happen in their company. And now they're hiring, a third of the people they laid off back. So who knows what's really going to happen with AI, but I still think, if we look at what is working and isn't working in the AI space is certain redundant work or repetitive work that is person to computer only work is ripe for automation and AI taking chunks of it over. Was it going to take everything over? I don't think so.
No,
but what it's not going to do is eliminate human to human work, right? And so, and to this point of, right, I think historically it's tale as old as time, right? We've been talking about it ever since I, got into leadership development. I'm sure since, the company I started with was founded probably in like the 70s. They've been talking about this too, which is, when the widget maker boss is promoted or retires, who do we promote into the widget maker boss position? It's the best widget maker on the team, not necessarily the person who has the best skills, right? The best leadership skills. And so I just kind of have this feeling like those folks, unfortunately, are going to be at an even bigger disadvantage in the coming years versus those who perhaps are, and I don't necessarily think we need to get into, which we could. We don't necessarily need to get into a discussion of like, how do we select better leaders? But, right, those who have some level of maybe already baked in emotional intelligence, social skills, self-regulation skills are going to do even better faster. That's not to say, and maybe this is something we can get into too. That's not to say that emotional intelligence can't be learned. Right. But I guess I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on that, right? I think it's going to become, and maybe we've been saying this forever, and this is now just our newest reason to say it, which is, that these human skills are going to become even more of a, I don't know, differentiator for those who have them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's already what we're living through. And, as you said, emotional intelligence is not soft skills. It is a business skill that helps leaders build trust, clarity, and performance through pressure. And that doesn't change. That just continues to increase, if anything. But, I think your kind of point earlier about selecting, how do we select? I think we actually need to shift the question. It's how do we build these leaders? Because emotional intelligence can be grown and developed. It's not unlike IQ, which normally teeters out, stays about the same once you get to adulthood. Emotional intelligence just continues to grow as you age. And so,
or devolve, maybe even.
Yeah, well, yes, for some.
Sure.
But that's where, you give them my card and they come to me. And
perfect.
But, what I found having worked internally in various organizations is whenever I worked with stakeholders on putting together leadership development programs, they always kind of want to jump to the questions of how do leaders lead teams? How do leaders lead the business? Which are very important questions. but they skip over the first foundational piece, which is how do leaders lead themselves? And that gets back to my moving leaders from reacting to responding. Because, talk about the change that we're living through today. A leader who is stuck in reacting is a leader who might default to micromanaging or over controlling. They might be avoiding hard conversations, or kind of on the flip side, just rushing to fix everything and changing everything at once, which ultimately leads your entire team reacting in the same way. Now, a leader that responds is one that builds in a pause. They pause, they name what's happening, assess what they're feeling, what the team is experiencing, and they move by providing clarity and choosing the next trust building action that they have. So this is why emotional intelligence matters so much. It's not about being nicer, which is a common myth that leaders often think. It's actually about turning emotions into data so leaders can respond with intention, especially in these moments of change and pressure.
So tell me, I would love to drill in a bit on leading self, right? Because I think an example, I still remember, and I'm going to, to protect the innocent, I won't say when and where, but I certainly, and actually it's probably happened more than once in my life, right? Where there's been a leader above myself in the team who very clearly has good days and bad days, and how that shows up, how that affects the team, how, and so, there's this classic drive-by, walk-by, but we call it this classic drive-by activity where the team members might kind of stop by each other's desks to do what's called a temperature check. How is, I'll just pick on you since you're here. How's Dana? How is Dana today? Basically, what kind of day is Dana having today? And is today the day to ask her this kind of question or that kind of question, right? And so, so there is this element of, are you taking care of yourself so that you can show up your best? So I guess I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on what do you mean by leading self?
Absolutely. And you're naming it this perfectly, because this is where organizations are struggling with it. Because as you said, organizations today are starting to name emotional intelligence and the human skills as the driver. They know this. And yet they're struggling with integrating it because for two kind of key reasons they get stuck in emotional intelligence. They either go too targeted, which, whenever I talk about my line of work, I get those exact same comments where someone's like, oh my God, my leader is terrible. You need to talk to them. We're like, how can I give them your card without it coming across as passive aggressive? And so the unique thing about emotional intelligence and what's different about other capabilities across the workforce is it sits in the intersection between personal and professional. And so when you go into too targeted, saying, again, any executive probably could be like, oh, I have these 5 leaders. I know exactly who are my black sheep, so to speak, who need this. If you go to them and say, you need emotional intelligence training, you're X, Y, and Z, they don't hear this is development. They hear you are a problem. There is something wrong with you. And rightfully so. How many of us would really respond pretty well to that type of development when someone approaches it as too targeted as to the work? Now, on the flip side, then we have organizations who don't want to go the too targeted right, and they go too generic. They go, okay, let's talk about emotional intelligence in theory and see if it just integrates. And so it becomes a nice conversation, but no real behavioral change occurs. And so the best approach as far as shifting someone from leading the self and building emotional intelligence is individual insight within a cohort-based learning environment. So leaders get to understand their specific patterns, but they also need to develop within that cohort in the organization, because the organization is now saying, not you are the problem. They're saying this is how we lead here. This is how we communicate under pressure. This is how we repair trust. And this is how we create clarity. And that narrative changes the entire experience of how we build leaders. And it's the foundation of the work I do with my EQ Lab developmental journey.
There was something that popped in my head that I wanted to ask about, which is, and I think you were sort of going here because the one, one way, and then I wanted to hear about this lab. To your point, right? We've got to be careful how we introduce this to leaders, right? Because it's not you are the problem. Frankly, it's kind of the opposite, which is you are the solution. And
yeah, I love that narrative.
The one thing that there's at least one high level person that I'm talking to, I want to protect their anonymity, who I think on a regular basis, and on a regular basis, one thing I'm talking to them about is, right, you need to start crystallizing your arguments in dollars and cents, for this leader, because they're clearly not hearing you, right? And so I think there's likely a business case, right, for right at now, because I wish we could say, and this is same from when I was in DNI, I wish we could say it's the right thing to do, so just do it. But I think we often have to, with organizations, explain to them why it makes business sense, right, to do this. So I guess I'd be curious what your findings, thoughts, or how you share with organizations why this is a business imperative outside of just we're all humans who spend 70% of our waking life at work. And so perhaps not being miserable is a good enough call to action.
When I talk about emotional tolerance and trust, we're not talking about, we talk about it and it feels so abstract. But what we really are talking about when we talk about the consequences of emotional tolerance, trust in an organization is how work moves through your organization. And that affects performance, retention, how people show up. And I usually use this analogy about looking at performance differently. If you've ever eaten at the restaurant Five Guys, you may have experienced that they always give you an extra scoop of fries at the bottom of the bag. And that's intentional. Now, if I was a CFO, I might be able to quote you how many millions of dollars, I'm losing on this extra scoop of fries. If I was someone in product or engineering, I might just redesign the cup so it fits the amount of fries. Neither of these are technically wrong, but they would miss the true net value effect of that action. And the psychological effect of generosity, extra warmth, that actually drives human behavior. And so this is really a psychological effect that we're talking about. We're not talking about we're not talking about these abstract concepts. We're talking about genuinely what is the human condition, the human drivers, emotional tolerance, trust, and building an environment that has those strong signals that support all of this.
I like that. I like that example because I was even going to say it's, what the CFO has to say, what, the product designers have to say, and then there's what marketing has to say. What's bringing people back? What is because I think since we both have some hospitality background, right? There's something about not to make this all about food, but it's, if you can if you can get someone to come back a third time, right? The likelihood that they will be an ongoing repeat customer is that much higher, right? And there's some research behind that. Like if you can get someone to your restaurant 3 times, the likelihood that they will be there a 4th time, 5th time, 6th time is it's exponential. And to your point, this is where marketing steps in. This is memorable. This is something we are then known for, right? Let alone, that Five Guys has a giant basket of salted shelled peanuts or unshelled peanuts. I don't know why, but they're there. It's just this extra, this generosity, right? That you are kind of feeling through the process as the consumer. And I even think back to some of the work we were doing with engagement surveys. Interestingly enough, right? And this was at the restaurant level, that the restaurants with a higher level of engagement at the employee level had higher performance numbers, right? Had greater sales, right? So there's like
Yeah.
some level of proof to when your, employees are happy to be there and treated well by their managers and, trusted, et cetera, that they in turn that how they treat the work, so to speak, right? And so in the hospitality, that's how they treat the guests. In a more corporate environment, it's how they're treating their peers, how they're, the discretionary effort that they bring.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I've lots of research to go back on. Like one of my favorites that I always share is Google's Project Aristotle. It found
Yeah.
the number one contributor to high performing teams was psychological safety. How do you build psychological safety? You have a leader with emotional intelligence and an environment full of trust. And it's those type of environments that we really need to focus on and build for. And it's funny because that study even drilled down to, well, what if it's a team of all high performers, but they're in this low trust environment compared to mediocre performers, high trust? The high trust team outperformed the low trust team. And that's really a marker of, the return on investment as far as focusing on building and shaping these environments that drive performance, drive sales, drive engagement, lower turnover. Headcount is always one of those most expensive costs of any organizations, and really getting people bought into what you're doing and integrating the changes that continuously keep coming around.
Well, I'm a firm believer in that no leader shows up wanting to be a monster.
True.
But, there are naysayers out there too who would say there's people who are wired for this and there's people just who are maybe not. So I guess I'd be curious what your experience has been with perhaps those who might be classified as not as wired for this. Like, how do you work with people who maybe this isn't as innate of a skill? Where do they start? How do you, work with those people
Absolutely.
to I don't know, get on their journey of
Yeah.
building.
Well, it's true. Actually, most people are wired for this. It takes organizations to really build this into their workforce that leaders can step up to this. But um, speaking to the leader themselves, I always encourage them first to ask, how well do you know your people? That's really the first piece. And so a practical action that a leader can take, to do with each of their direct report is to do a intentional conversation, not just a status update, but ones that include questions like, what are you working towards? What's creating friction in your spends? What do you need more clarity on from me? And what is one thing that I can do differently to better support you? Those simple questions. Get to know your team, because when I talk about earlier the leader who reacts versus respond, this connects directly into that, because when you know your people, that built-in pause becomes even more useful. You, instead of asking, you start with, of course, how am I feeling? But then you start asking, given what I know about this person, this team, this moment in time, what clarity can I provide? And what would that action of trust be?
I would even go a step further because I like that, because I would say, I talk about having really good open career conversations with people too, just around what is it that they want to do? What are they here for? So I like the, what's getting in their way? What can I unlock for you? I would even go a step further and say, if you don't truly know what you're now, I'm not encouraging people to get like inappropriately interested in their people
Of course not.
and
Yeah.
their personal lives, but you should probably know a thing or two about your employees' life outside of work too, right? I think for years there was this leave your personal life at the door kind of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And my, my terrible saying is, no one is paid to take a bullet for someone they don't like, except for perhaps the Secret Service, right? And that is not a political statement. That is, I've said that under every administration. But right, like not with your peers, with your direct reports, there's a bit of even benefit of the doubt that one can earn when intentional about relationships, when intentional about wanting to know a little bit more about you than just your work output and what you're good at. Right. So
Yeah.
I would kind of add that to that. Like, spend a little time getting to know people and asking, as silly as it is, how was your weekend? What'd you get up to? Go ahead.
No, I agree. And it's a slightly changed conversation, but I think kind of going into today's world, especially, we are living in what I call, the attention economy. Everything is trying to grab your attention off hours, and that affects how you show up at work. And so, yes, when you have someone who actually pays attention to you, and not trying to always cipher something from you, but actually wants to get to know you as a human being, that shifts how people work with you. And so, that I love that call out, because I think it is so important for a leader to get to know them, not just on the, where they want to go in their career, but also just what's happening, what's affecting, your day, both positive and negative,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've got to start bringing us in for a landing here. So let's start with, I write a lot about how hard it is for leaders who have just been promoted, because most organizations don't have a lot of kind of programmatic support to teach a director how to stop being a manager, or teach a, VP how to stop being a director, and therefore how to be a director or be a VP. But first, just to take that, back a step, for those leaders out there who are thinking about their next promotion, trying to prepare themselves for their next, for that next promotion, to get that next level, do you have one piece of advice for those leaders?
It's about understanding that as a leader, you don't need to have all the answers. Actually, people aren't looking for you to have all the answers. It's about giving people clarity. And that confuses some people sometimes, because clarity doesn't mean answers sometimes. Sometimes it means, this is how much I know. This is how much I don't know. And this is what you can count on from me on this team. That's what clarity really means. And again, that's the reality that we're living through in constant uncertainty. That's the type of leadership that really helps navigate the team. People trust a leader who can tell you, even when they don't have all the answers, why they're making their decision and how to move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd add to that even, what are the guardrails and what's the tolerance for, mistakes, right? With this current situation or what have you. Awesome. So for those leaders who have found themselves in their first week or first month at a new level, they're getting their bearing, they're trying to, learn how to be a director, learn how to be a VP, and leave the old role behind. What's one piece of advice you have for them?
Kind of going back to my story in the beginning, be human. We're not leaders, we're not asking you to be, these all impressive beings. We're asking you to be human, have human moments. But it's about how you show up next. It's about how you react and consider how it impacts the team. And yes, kind of full circle, talking about that shift of reacting to responding.
I like how you put that, because I think a lot of leaders feel that the promotion itself wasn't the proof that they should be in the role, right? That they kind of enter in to feel like I now need to prove that they made the right decision, prove to everybody, my new direct reports, my new peers, my boss, that they made the right choice. And I feel like they don't ask for help quickly enough, or
Absolutely. New leaders are notorious, actually all leaders, but new leaders especially are notorious for imposter syndrome. And and that's kind of one of, I'm sure, the work that you do as well. Is my work is not training you to be this exact leader. My work is training you to be your specific best self leader. And that does not mean you're going to copy every single framework that comes your way. Some things are going to work for you, some things are not. It's about finding your identity as a leader, but again, understanding the key ingredients, as it were, that really help drive performance underneath it all.
So for those out there who want a little more Dana Echert in their lives, where do they find you? Where do they find more information on your company?
Yeah. You can go to my website, inspireskillstraining.com. And the work that I often do with organizations is if an organization is going through a moment of change right now, and they need help with their leaders to have that framework and shift from reacting to responding in the moment, is a trust and EQ reset workshop that helps integrate a real moment of change. And then for organizations who want to turn leadership development into a standard, not just a one-time workshop, there's that EQ lab, that's a 3-month journey for true behavioral change that includes that individual insight within a cohort-based learning that I spoke about earlier.
Nice. Awesome. Well, Dana, thank you so much for coming today. This was a fun conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I always love talking about leadership and love the work that you do.
Me too. Thank you. All right. Take it easy. That brings us to the end of our episode. Thank you for listening. I'd encourage you to head on over to my website, kent.coach, and start a conversation with me there, or check out my Promoted Leader Toolkit at kent.coach/toolkit. Before you go on with your day, please take a moment to leave a rating and a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Click the 5 stars. That helps put this podcast in front of more ears. Till next time, take it easy.